I call this meeting to order, the 16th meeting of the Standing Committee on Finance. The orders today, pursuant to Standing Order 1082, the study of the progress report on monitoring and oversight for the 2009 federal budget. We have with us here today again Mr. Kevin Page, the Parliamentary Budget Officer. Mr. Page, welcome back to the committee. And if I could ask you in your opening presentation perhaps to introduce your colleagues at the table. You have up until a 10-minute or so opening statement, and then we'll go to questions from members. But welcome back to the committee. It's good to have you back, and please begin at any time.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just if I may, I can introduce the panel that we have at the front here. I have on my left, sir, I have members. I have Mr. Sihir Khan. He's our Assistant Parliamentary Budget Officer for Expenditure and Revenue Analysis. On my right, I have Mustafa Askari. He's our Assistant Parliamentary Budget Officer for Economic and Fiscal Analysis. And on his right, I have Mr. Chris Mate. He's our Senior Director, Economic Fiscal Analysis. Members, if I may today, what I'd like to do is spend some time again talking about the quarterly report, but also focus my remarks on the economy, give you an update on the economic situation as well relative to the budget. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, Vice Chairs and members of the Standing Committee on Finance. Thank you for the invitation to speak to you today regarding the Government's Budget 2009 Progress Reports to Parliament. Bon après-midi, Monsieur le Président, Monsieur le Vice-Président et membre du Comité permanent des Finances.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, Vice Chairs and members of the Standing Committee on Finance. As you may recall, in late February, my office released a discussion paper that suggested information to be included in these reports. In that note, we stated that in the PBO's view, the central goal of these progress reports to Parliament should be to provide Parliament with accurate, timely, and easily understood information on three key issues. First, the implementation and progress of budget measures. Second, recent economic and fiscal developments and prospects. And third, assessing budget results relative to its guiding principles, those principles being timely, targeted, and temporary. On March 10, 2009, the government presented its first progress report. My remarks today update our previous work by highlighting what my office views as some successes from this report, some areas for potentially improved reporting to Parliament in future reports, and lastly, a brief update on the economic and fiscal context.
Following. The Government's first report represents an important first step towards improving interim reporting to Parliament and will ultimately strengthen Parliament's budgetary oversight role. As a result, Parliament may wish to consider making permanent some type of progress reporting requirement to ensure this increased transparency for future budgets. Secondly, the Government's second report in June should address key information gaps that are highlighted in our updated monitoring and oversight framework. This includes identifying the uses of the $3 billion Treasury Board Vote 35, including output and outcome indicators for all budget measures, as well as key implementation risks, and finally updating the Government's view on changes to the economic and fiscal outlook. This leads me to my third key message. Recent economic data and the PBO's updated survey of private sector forecasters suggest a further significant deterioration in the outlook for the Canadian economy relative to Budget 2009 fiscal planning assumptions. Comme on l'a mentionné dans notre rapport précédent, la capacité du Parlement d'assurer une surveillance efficace du plan d'action.
As noted in our previous report, Parliament's ability to provide effective oversight of the Government's Economic Action Plan rests on timely, accurate, and relevant information and analysis. To this end, my staff drafted an oversight and monitoring framework for the Government's budgetary measures. This is based on practices identified from other jurisdictions, such as the Government of New Zealand's regular in-year public updates on key risks. We are aware of the need to minimize any additional reporting burden on departments, so we suggested that the government use indicators primarily drawn from its own internal processes and external publications. This includes key indicators such as the objective risk assessment performed by the government as part of every Treasury Board submission, which is outlined on the Treasury Board Secretariat's website. The initial monitoring and oversight template has now been updated with the additional data released by the government in its first quarterly report. We have also posted a separate briefing note on our website that provides a more detailed assessment of results to date. However, today, I want to emphasize to you the benefits of this type of in-year reporting and commend the government in its efforts to build a new leading practice in public reporting. We anticipate that the government will have more time over the next quarter to compile the additional indicators for June's progress report. Depending on which information gaps remain after the second report, my staff may begin a more detailed assessment of potential higher risk initiatives based on comparables derived from other jurisdictions and international best practices.
Evolving economic situation, it is important that Parliament has access to up-to-date information on the economic and fiscal outlook. The government's first progress report provided little information on how the Canadian economic outlook has changed since the budget was presented in January, or what these economic changes might mean for the fiscal balance. Therefore, my office has done the following three things. First, for the first time, we are reporting the PBO's near-term outlook for key economic output and labour market variables. Secondly, we've also updated our PBO survey of forecasters. And finally, we have used the Department of Finance fiscal sensitivities to give a rough sense of current risk to Budget 2009 fiscal projections. The government's progress report states that recent economic developments are broadly in line with budget projections. In the PBO's view, however, since Budget 2009 was tabled, high-frequency indicators for both the Canadian and global economies have revealed further weakness. The IMF now expects the global economy to contract this year, representing the first decline in the post-war period. And members, if you're looking at the slide presentation, slide 4 has a presentation on, or has a slide showing basically the outlook for the International Monetary Fund. This global weakness has had two main impacts on Canada. First, it has reduced demand for Canada's exports. And second, it has sharply reduced commodity prices, and in turn, the purchasing power of Canadian households and businesses. Recent Canadian data show, one, a decline in real output that accelerated in December, with the Canadian economy recording a 3.4% drop on an annualized basis in the fourth quarter of 2008, due largely to weak household consumption, business investment, and exports. It also revealed a continuing slowdown in housing, and more than 200,000 jobs were lost in January and February 2009. On slide 7, members, in the presentation, we have additional information on recent indicators. PBO currently expects real, that is, inflation-adjusted gross domestic product to drop by about 8.5% in the first quarter of 2009, and by 3.5% in the second quarter. So again, we have some slides on slide 8 actually provides the figures for real GDP and nominal GDP. Because of the weakness in overall prices, the situation for nominal GDP is actually worse, with declines of roughly 15% and 4% respectively in the first and second quarter. Associated with this drop in output, PBO roughly expects 380,000 jobs will be lost over the first half of this year. Turning to the economic outlook for 2009 and 2010, regrettably, I'm once again reporting that private sector economic forecasts have been revised downwards. These results, which now fully incorporate forecasters' expected impacts of the government's economic action plan, suggest that the current Canadian recession will be sharper than assumed in Budget 2009, with real output expected to fall further below its trend potential than in either the 1980s or the 1990s recession. And we have a slide on slide 13 that provides that historical perspective. Nominal GDP, the broadest measure of the government's tax base, is expected to fall about 4.5% this year, with roughly equivalent contributions expected from falling prices and from falling volumes. For the next 2 years, nominal GDP is now expected to be significantly lower than forecast in Budget 2009. This despite the government's prudent decision to lower its growth assumption below its January survey average. And we have, again, I refer you to slide 14. With a weaker economy comes a weaker labor market. The PBO survey suggests a drop of employment of about 2% in 2009, or roughly 350,000 jobs on an annual basis, with only a slight turnaround of 0.3% in 2010. Similarly, the unemployment rate is expected to rise further in the next 2 years. The survey average is for a peak of just over 9% in 2010, which is below that experienced during the past recession. We've not had time to fully model the implied fiscal impacts of our new economic survey. Instead, we have applied the Department of Finance fiscal sensitivities to the new outlook. This analysis suggests additional downside risks to the government's budget balance forecast in Budget 2009, mainly because of lower tax revenues. The implied budget deficits are $38 billion in 2009-10 and $35 billion in 2010-11, compared with budget projections of about $34 billion in 2009-10 and $30 billion in 2010-11. You may recall that Budget 2009 stimulus goals are to increase GDP by 1.9% and create and maintain 190,000 jobs by the end of 2010. With that in mind, please let me now discuss 3 outstanding issues. The first issue is whether the current stimulus has been effective or will be effective. Thus far, the government and Parliament have moved in a timely fashion to approve budget measures. The government's first progress report states that approvals for 90% of the measures are expected to be in place for April 1st, 2009. It will take additional time to get money out the door and fully implement these programs, many of which require cooperation from key partners, including other levels of government. Therefore, at this point, it is simply not possible to disentangle the incremental stimulus effects of the government's economic action plan. Indeed, no reasonable assessment can be made until these measures have been implemented and more time has passed. The second issue is the potential need for additional stimulus in light of the fact that the average downward forecast revision in our survey during the past 2 months exceeds the estimated positive impacts of the government stimulus package. This certainly suggests that even if the current stimulus measures have their full impact, Canada faces a larger economic challenge than what was envisioned when the budget was prepared. But let me be clear, this statement on its own does not necessarily imply that more stimulus is required. As a small open economy, Canada's recovery depends not only on the actions of policymakers that policymakers are taking to provide accommodative fiscal and monetary policies, but also depends crucially on global economic and fiscal developments. I refer you to slides 21 and 22 where we provide a historical perspective on the projected downturn relative to previous recessions in the 90s and 80s. The final issue is whether the current stimulus measures are sustainable over the long term. In this regard, the government's stated goal in Budget 2009 is to enact mainly temporary measures that will avoid long-term structural deficits. In our own previous words, the PBO has provided its rough estimates of the government's structural budget balance, which is what the government's budget balance would be if the economy were functioning at its potential. The government's own estimate of its structural budget balance is needed to meaningfully assess progress towards this goal. Let me conclude by saying that these progress reports represent an historical opportunity to strengthen budget transparency regarding the implementation oversight, and effectiveness of government budgets. Therefore, my office encourages Parliament to consider making permanent some type of progress reporting requirement to ensure that this increased level of transparency remains in future budgets. As always, we hope that parliamentarians find this work relevant and timely, and we look forward to any suggestions you may have to help us serve you better. Thank you once again for the opportunity to speak to you today. I would be pleased to take your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Page, for your presentation, and thank you for the information you've provided to all committee members. We'll go with Mr. McCallum. You have 7 minutes for the opening round.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Page and colleagues of Mr. Page. I'd like to just comment very briefly before I begin that we in the Liberal Party support your work very strongly, and we will do what we can to ensure that your budget is restored to the level that had been committed. That is $2.7 million a year. It's not clear the combined opposition can force that to happen, but our position is we will seek to get a motion through the Library Committee requesting the government to increase the estimates in such a way that your budget promise is adhered to. My first question, in terms of parliamentary scrutiny, as you may know, we in the Liberal Party have our own website now on probation.ca, but one thing we cannot do is monitor the extent to which the government truly gets the money out the door in the way in which it has promised to do on infrastructure, on business development bank lending, for example, among other things. I don't see how an outside group like an opposition party or outside economists can do that. And so my question to you is, would it be your intention to obtain that kind of information from government departments, through Treasury Board, infrastructure, and so on? Have you spoken to government departments as to whether they would cooperate with you in providing such information? And if so, what has been the nature of their response?
Thank you, Mr. McCallum, both for your support, the Liberal Party's support for the PBO budget issue. We too would like to get it rectified as soon as possible to help us kind of provide quality services to you in the future. In terms of what we can do on the reporting side, what we released today and will be made available on our website, we've updated our detailed monitoring tables, both on the economic side and on the fiscal side. And on the fiscal side, it includes, on a program-by-program basis, all the measures that were in the budget. We've broken down those tables to kind of look at, again, we've updated them for the authorities that were kind of, they've been passed already, and further authorities that may be required. We also highlight that there's information gaps with respect to these tables, so we've highlighted those information gaps that are available on our website. So these information gaps, they'll deal with how the money will flow on a program-by-program basis. They will deal with the output indicators that are required on a program-by-program basis and the outcome indicators that were required as well, so we can measure the impact assessment.
Okay, but one thing you don't refer to directly, unless I missed it, all of those things you just described are very good. But first and foremost, I'd like to know how many dollars, let's say in the month of April, in the month of May, in the month of June, the government gets out the door for infrastructure, for business credit, and for other things. Now, will you be able to get those numbers from the government?
Well, in terms of how the money will flow, I should say, actually, to answer your earlier question, what officials have we met with recently? I have met with Minister Flaherty and Minister Tays. We talked about a role that the PBO potentially could play in terms of the implementation framework, and even potentially looking at risk assessments on some of these programs in terms of getting the money out the door. We made the offer that we would be willing to do that, but we would need to have access to appropriate information. I think it's fair to say that both Minister Tay and Minister Flaherty took that under advisement, and we haven't heard back. I made the same point more recently with Mr. Wright, the Deputy Minister of Finance. I met with him yesterday, indicating that we can play with the role. So we've made the offer. We think if the support is there from Parliament for us to play this role, We've also, with our recent quarterly report, we laid out a framework. We could make sure that that framework meets your standards, your needs of all parliamentarians, that it has a month-by-month flow of information. But if there's the support, I think, around this table and from the government side, we certainly be willing to play that role.
All right, because we may well come back with such a resolution, but given recent events, we're not inclined to either trust the government's numbers or believe that they will deliver even following resolutions. So I guess what I'm hearing you say, and maybe Mr. Menzies can clarify when his turn comes as to whether the government will support you, but it seems to me Parliament is dependent in a significant way on your good offices if we are to have any chance of finding out in a neutral way which dollars have actually gone out the door. And it sounds from what you're saying that there's still more work to do on that file. Okay, if I can now shift to the economy. I think what you're saying for the first quarter of 2009 is quite dramatic. That you have, and that's the quarter that ends 6 days from now. So we're talking about right now. And you're saying that gross domestic product, real gross domestic product in Canada this quarter will have fallen by, I think, 8.4%, which is, I think, is at a record at least since the First World War. Sir. And you're saying that, and I think that's a bigger drop than we've seen in the United States, at least so far, in a quarter. And you're saying nominal GDP will fall by more than 15% in this quarter. Now,
well, 1 minute, Mr. McCallum.
The question I would have is, certainly those are shocking numbers. Are those your estimates? And you can see from the table that it's about the drop in GDP in the first quarter of 2009 you're projecting is at least 3 times bigger than what the budget projected. So 3 times worse than the budget not very long ago. Question is, are those enormous drops in GDP your estimates, or are they the private sector consensus, or some blend of the two?
Thank you. These are actually, it's a combination effort. We have surveyed 8 private sector forecasters for 2009 and 10, and so the numbers that we're presenting for the first 2 quarters reflect the monitoring that we've done. We will be releasing a document early next week that will detail exactly what we expect for the first and second quarter. So we basically overlaid with this an additional level of detail because these, as you say, sir, are historic numbers. So we will provide a very detailed tracking of what's going on. What it does reflect, though, are a lot of negative forces that we've seen coming through the fourth quarter, very, very sharp decline, sir, in December of 2008. We have a number of high-frequency indicators for the first part of 2009, export indicators, manufacturing shipment indicators. We have data on retail sales. We've seen the labor market numbers as well. So we have quite a bit of information now for the first quarter. But I think when you see the level of transparency that we'll provide in the first half of the year with the reports that we'll release early next week, I think you'd be quite comforted in the level of detail. But to back up, it reflects both the private sector monitoring plus our own detailed assessment. We've taken it a step further.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. McCallum. We'll go Monsieur Laforêt.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, Mr. Page. And thank you to the colleagues who have accompanied you today. We want to talk about your budget. It's an issue that we want to address again, and we, the Bloc Québécois, fully support your role and hope that you will receive the $2.7 million that you requested to have a proper operating budget in order for you to fully live up to your role. This is a democratic issue. On page 4 of your remarks, you say that there's current stimulus in the budget and that they have a maximum effect. Canada, nonetheless, will be confronted with an even worse situation. But it's not necessarily clear that we should be introducing new stimulus into the economy. By saying that, are you not also saying that the stimulus measures have to be more focused, more targeted, and that they may not be doing the job? In other words, is that what you're also saying? Thank you for your question, Mr. Laforêt. A few comments about my budget. There are restrictions on the PBO's budget.
Absolument nécessaire que il y a une résolution permanente pour notre.
So there has to be a permanent resolution regarding our budget. But you also asked a very significant question about policy and about the output gap in our economy. For us, it is obvious that the economic outlook is much worse than the assumptions made in Budget 2009. And in terms of the output gap, we're talking about the discrepancy between potential and the current economic outlook. It's possible to consider whether or not it is possible to introduce stimulus in order to narrow this gap, but there's also a matter of implementing the budget now. Allow me to give you an example. The government introduced in Budget 2009 measures regarding EI and extending EI by 5 weeks. But according to the most recent statistics, 25% of those who pay in to EI are only going to be eligible to receive that extended benefit. And in fact, the government also talked about canceling the 2-week waiting period. Somewhere along the way, in your reports, will you say that the measures have to be more focused and the government's measures have to be much more targeted, especially relative to EI and the 2-week waiting period? Because that also constitutes an economic stimulus. People who receive benefits during those first 2 weeks of waiting are able to contribute economically. Yes, the EI program has been boosted, and that is an example of stimulus. I'm not very comfortable talking about the different options in such a context, but I am more comfortable talking about the economic outlook. I can say that under that situation, the difference between the budget's economic outlook and our current economic outlook is significant, particularly in terms of employment levels.
We're looking at an additional 250,000 jobs lost, relative to the budget track. So effectively 250,000 people more unemployed in 2009 relative to the budget track. So when you think of the severity of the recession in that kind of context and potentially the need to do something, I think it's more our job to provide that type of context in terms of the outlook than to suggest potential policy implications.
Dans la première partie de votre allocution,
in the first page of your remarks, you also state that for the second progress report, we must have a better idea of how the government intends to identify ways of spending the Treasury Board Vote 35. I think this is highly significant because the Auditor General had expressed major concerns about TB Vote 35. To your mind, what is the best way to identify the uses of the $3 billion Treasury Board Vote 35?
The Treasury Board and the Minister of Finance, I did make the point that I thought it was absolutely necessary that a list be provided to parliamentarians on how that fund would be used, on Vote 35 rather would be used. I also thought, I also again made, as I noted earlier, that we'd be willing to kind of provide a due diligence on basically Treasury Board Secretary's risk assessment as they provide it through, but we would need access to information. I think, in terms of, Mr. McCallum's point, I think we could, in terms of looking at the flow of that money, I think it should be not only identified in the next quarterly report, but we should, whatever system that we use to monitor the flow of money and its impact indicators, both in an output sense and an outcome sense, should be incorporated in the next quarterly report. So I think there's an opportunity to integrate the report, but I think we do need to identify it, and as we move forward to the next quarterly report, the items that we actually spend the money on should be identified.
Very briefly, since the Finance Committee adopted a motion to have you appear before this committee following each government progress report, do you need a very specific and defined framework within which you can table a report on the government's quarterly progress reports? Would you like to receive a very specific mandate for the second quarter?
Now, the tables are so detailed that we didn't photocopy them today because I think it would have been a distraction. But we do have ideas on what the level of detail could be. We were impressed with actually Chapter 4 in the quarterly report, the level of detail that was provided, and I think the government should be applauded that level of detail. We would like to see that detail move forward so we can capture Mr. McCallum's point. We're seeing how money is being tracked, and we also look at the impact assessment on the economy. So we do have a good idea, sir. Je vous remercie pour votre question.
Merci beaucoup. Mr. Menzies.
Thank you for your question.
Chair, and thank you, Mr. Page, and your colleagues for appearing here today. And I guess if Mr. McCallum can talk about his party, I guess I might remind him that it was actually the Conservative Party that established this position in Budget 2006 because we saw a need for it. And we maintain that, despite what you might hear from the suggestions otherwise. This is very important, it's very critical, and even more critical in these economic times that we're facing. And the more information that members of Parliament can get, the better job they will be able to do in representing their constituents. So we applaud your work. There was some discussion here about and you referred to it as well in answering Mr. McCallum's question about actually tracking how the money's going out. We have a website that will explain where and how the money flows. So it will be. We have a website on what's going on, what our goals are, how our goals are being achieved in Afghanistan. So I pushed hard for that. The minister thought it was a great idea, and we now have a website to follow that, where the money's going. So we are being accountable, and we think that's very important. Just after your last appearance, I think we were wondering about making sure that you got the information that you requested. So I put in a request to the Finance Department just to make sure. I had suggested I thought you had received all the information you had requested, and at that time they said that there was no further outstanding requests. And I understand there's one now that hasn't been fulfilled, but there's still the question mark about cabinet confidentiality. So just for your information, that will be coming, whatever isn't cabinet confidentiality. I do want to, in your March 11th report, you made some comments where you use GDI numbers rather than GDP numbers, and if we can, I can get you to explain why you use those numbers. And comparing Canada and the U.S. in the fourth quarter, real GDP year-ago level provides a better reflection of recent trend growth. It suggested similar performances in the two economies, and then a little bit of editorializing, if I can make a comment. You said the GDI numbers plunging. Not sure if an economist needs to use that harsh language, but that's your decision. 15.3%, 10 times larger than the U.S. A pretty strong suggestion, given the fact that our GDP numbers don't reflect that. And can I ask why you used in that report GDI numbers, and in this you seem to go back to the GDP numbers? Can you explain the difference as it reflects in the strengths of our economy? I mean, we're projecting to come out of this 30% debt to GDP ratio, and the Americans arguably aren't far short of 100%. That's a huge difference, and yet your GDI numbers are showing something different. Can you explain that to me?
Sure. So just as your earlier points about the websites and the information requests, and then we'll talk about the economic question. First, I think your government should be, first applauded for the kind of transparency that we saw in the first trimester report, and again, particularly on the aspect of the report that kind of went through and showed how the authorities were being updated so the money could flow. And I don't think the government was really in a position to go beyond that because, I mean, the authorities were just being put in place. So, but again, so there's some complimentary language in the reports today and about that level of transparency and that level of detail. Like for us, from the point of view of setting the standard, I think if we can maintain that standard as we move forward and we're showing the money flowing on a program-by-program level basis at that level of detail, kind of the point Mr. McCallum raised, I think that would actually go a long way to satisfying everybody and probably would really be a best practice internationally in the world today. So what we highlighted today were potentially some information gaps, and I think they were normal. There are information gaps in the sense that we expect them to be in the first report, but in terms of the second report, we didn't really see the indicators of where that you'll be using to assess either the flow of the money or the impact assessment of those programs once in place, what they're intended to achieve. But I'm sure that hopefully they will be in the next report. So we're just putting a marker down. In terms of information requested to the Department of Finance, so thank you again for your support. We still have not received. We've made repeated requests. When we provide these economic provisions and do our analysis, we make them available to you. And again, most of us here, and certainly this side of the table, all spent many, many years at the Department of Finance. In fact, to my right, I have both two of the senior directors of forecasting of finance, Mustafa Askari and Chris Matei. But we still have not got back the information we requested. We're familiar for what is cabinet confidence and what is not cabinet confidence. The information we want has actually been published in the past and was actually made available on a regular to private sector forecasts so they can do their work. We just want that same ability to have that same information. I made that point to Mr. Rob Wright yesterday, the Deputy Minister of Finance. Sir, on the economic point that you raised, why did we look at GDI and GDP, and are we moving away from it today in today's report? But first, I think more importantly, why look at different measures? I think what we tried to do, sir, in the March 11th report is provide a broader perspective on what was happening in the fourth quarter from different perspectives. So we provided the numbers on GDP. We showed the 3.5% decline roughly on a quarter-to-quarter basis. We showed the decline in nominal GDP, which is over a double-digit decline on a quarter-to-quarter basis in the fourth quarter. We showed the decline in gross domestic income, which really is a measure of income that takes into account of commodity price changes really through the terms of trade, which is a measure StatsCan releases and is released by the statistical agencies in the United States. So we gave you three indicators, and we provided them all. So we did not provide, we wanted to give a more comprehensive view. And we compared that both when you look at the quarter, and you annualize, and when you look at the trends over the past year. So it's a very backward looking. There's no forecast involved in that kind of perspective. And for earlier in the year, early in 2008, when the Canadian economy, actually our output numbers were sagging a little bit, but a lot of economists were looking at gross domestic income because they're saying, because of the high dollar and commodity prices were still staying high, we were flagging that as saying this is a positive thing. It was supporting tax bases, it was supporting purchasing power. But what happened is, what we've seen is, I think most Canadians have witnessed it, the plunge in commodity prices, the plunge in oil prices, but other commodities as well. And that's reflected very much. It's really picked up in the gross domestic income price. But we wanted people to see what that looks like, both on a quarter-to-quarter perspective and when you look over the past year from a year-over-year perspective. So we made those numbers available. It's to provide a broader perspective. So purchasing power, because Canadians benefit so much by commodity prices, Canadians we wanted to give that kind of broader perspective. We provided in our information in our PowerPoint today information both
wrap up very briefly,
for all those measures have been provided again today, sir. So we're providing measures for the first half of the year, GDP, GNP, and GDI, gross domestic income, on a real basis.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Menzies. Monsieur Mulcair.
Monsieur le Président,
Thank you, Chair. From the outset, I wish to welcome Mr. Page. Now, it's commonplace to say that you are a humble servant, but you are an extraordinary servant of this House. In fact, the work that you do helps us significantly as we move through these economic times. I was very happy to hear Mr. McCallum say something for once. In fact, I'm going to be quite generous and say that he made a few interesting comments because he said that the intentions of his colleagues within the Liberal Party were not always clear. So I'm actually delighted to hear Mr. McCallum say that. However, I do have some trouble with what was said about the government side, because Mr. McCallum said was asking if all three opposition parties could actually force this government to make sure that the office would get its $2.7 million budget. It is our feeling that we must do nothing to muzzle the office of the Parliamentary Budget Office. But obviously, there's nothing preventing the government from supporting us in our request. But allow me to explain myself, Mr. Chair. Allow me to explain the problem. Technically speaking, when we receive our agenda for a meeting, it says that the first witness is the Library of Parliament. That is formally what has been listed, Library of Parliament. Following that, we have the names of those appearing. Our two extraordinary collaborators are employees of the Library of Parliament. So let's just look at how absurd this situation is. I have here briefing notes prepared for the House of Commons Standing Committee on Finance that is prepared by the Library of Parliament. And what do we find within this document? A series of suggested questions. So we have the Library of Parliament suggesting to MPs questions to ask their colleagues. Clearly, there's something that's not working. Allow me to repeat Mr. Wallace's words and Mr. Menzies' words. Earlier, they had correctly reminded us that it was the Conservatives who deserve the credit for creating the position of the Parliamentary Budget Officer. But in the House of Commons, we hear that it is a moral issue. We have to follow the will of the House of Commons. The Prime Minister, when he was leader of the opposition, refused to follow the will of Parliament. Now, is he truly acting morally? I want to remind you that the Standing Committee on the Library of Parliament is actually going to meet tomorrow. Coincidentally, we are going to be there, and I hope that the official opposition will follow through on its promises. I want to address a technical question to Mr. Page. I'd like to know if the new figures for the deficit, which are rather alarming figures, now, do those figures take into account the increased costs for running the employment insurance program? I have the impression that it's no. I will start, and perhaps Mustafa or Chris will be able to provide further detail.
we did not, again, as we said, have full time to do a model-based projection, fiscal projection based on the changed economic numbers. So we use sensitivities. We have detailed sensitivity numbers or sensitivities that we can look at to look at changes if the unemployment rate changes, if GNP changes, what's the impact on unemployment insurance, what's the impact on tax bases. So we've used those sensitivities. Primarily in the numbers that we've used, the higher numbers that we reported today, again, we're looking at a deficit for 2009 of roughly, we're saying about $38 billion compared to roughly $34 billion for 2009. And it's just roughly $4 or $5 billion higher, and that's pretty much the same thing for 2010. It primarily reflects the lower GNP numbers, which is the broadest measure we have of income to support the tax base. What we've noted here today is that we're looking at a much weaker labor market, as you've noted today. So our unemployment rate on average is going to be about a full percentage point higher for 2009, according to private sector forecasters. We're seeing employment, which right now in the budget forecast was down about 0.5% in 2009. Now we're looking at down about 2% on a year-over-year basis in 2009. So I'll ask Mustafa and Chris whether or not there's some upside risk to our deficit numbers that we presented here as a result of the fact that we have not done a full model-based scenario, and particularly related to the issue of a weaker labor market.
I think I just confirmed what Mr. Page said. We use the sensitivity numbers, which should reflect
the higher
all
EI,
the shocks,
the higher EI.
all the shocks to the system. Now, this is not a detailed forecast. This is just applying a rule that the Department of Finance has provided, and we just applied that. If we were to do a full fiscal projection, the numbers probably would have been somewhat different.
Je tiens, Monsieur le Président, en terminant, à réitérer.
Conclusion, Mr. Chair, I wish to repeat our confidence, our trust in your office, the Office of the Parliamentary Budget Officer, and all of the individuals here. I do want to remind that the officials from the Library of Parliament, that it's true, we have to decide how this new office is going to be structured. And it has to be respected because it is an instrument. This office is an instrument that will facilitate the work of parliamentarians. I've always trusted employees of the Library of Parliament. I think they've done an extraordinary job, and they render an extraordinary service. But you must understand that this is a matter of trusteeship. The Parliamentary Budget Officer has a public role, and he must have a budget to work accordingly.
Chair, thank you, witnesses. I certainly would be one to support the transfer of Mr. Mulclair to the Library of Parliament committee. I'm sure Mr. Page would feel much more secure in his desire to improve his budgetary prospects. Usually there's a bit of a rule of thumb with respect to nominal GDP, and the government's revenues fall according to nominal GDP. What is kind of the rule of thumb that applies to a 1% drop in nominal GDP?
If you know the number.
The elasticity handy, we'll get you the number very shortly.
Okay, well, let me while you're doing that, I'll just go to the second.
But sir, if I could just to add into that, what we presented in our tables today on nominal GDP, we've shown both the percentage changes. We've shown what was put in quite wisely by the government, a prudence factor, so we've identified that. We've showed it in absolute dollar terms in our budgetary tables. So you can see the absolute figures, and you'll see it's roughly about $30 billion lower for 2009, roughly the same amount in 2010. The effective tax rate on that $35 billion is about 15%. In terms of its impact on revenues overall. But in terms of the elasticity, Chris will.
The sensitivities provided in Budget 2009 are on page 232 and 233. And if you took a rough approximation, if they were equivalent reductions in the volume and on the price side, as a sort of simple average, you'd probably end up with something like around $2 billion in the first year for a 1% decline in nominal GDP. But the composition of that reduction matters crucially. If the reduction stemmed entirely from a reduction in real GDP, the impact would be probably around $3.5 billion. So it's crucial to know what's driving the reduction in nominal GDP.
So you're projecting, at least in that quarter here, something in the order of 15% reduction in nominal GDP. It's not the same going forward, but that's enormous.
The average number of nominal GDP, I think, Chris, is at 4.4% for 2009 decline?
So that's roughly, I think, 38 billion, or sorry, almost $30 billion decline in the first year, and about 35 billion in the level of nominal GDP in the next year. That's slide 15 in
slide 15. I'm looking at 30. You got 38 in 09, 10, and 35 in 10, 11. Okay. Now, one thing that's always concerned me when you see the unemployment rate accelerating and the level of employment decelerating, you get a double whammy effect. You have a citizen who's no longer contributing taxes, and you have a citizen that's drawing, in some cases at least, EI. Have you calculated into your revenue projections that double whammy effect?
The calculations, again, and I hesitate to call them projections because these are using not our fiscal sensitivities, and this really isn't a new projection. This is just a rough it's a rough calculation to provide an idea of how things would be compared to budget 2009. But the fiscal sensitivities that the Department of Finance Canada provides would capture that directly and indirectly, those impacts from the labor market.
I'm a little lost in the toing and froing with your Department of Finance. Are you getting that data in a timely fashion?
We are not being provided with the underlying details of the projections in the budget that would correspond to, let's say, the level of employment. The level of the unemployment rate is being provided, but key variables such as corporate profits and wages and salaries that matter crucially for tax revenues have not been provided to date. And that's exactly the type of information that we would
even the numbers that you're... Sorry. Okay. One final question with respect to the nominal EI deficit. Have you done a calculation as to what the nominal EI deficit might be for this year?
No, we have not. It would not be hard to do, though.
No. I would just point out, too, from my experience on the sensitivities, I think there is an implicit assumption that the break-even sort of setting of employment or contribution rates are operative in this case. So to the extent the numbers that we provided probably definitely would, I think, understate the fiscal impact on that.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Monsieur Carrier.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, Mr. Page. Good afternoon to your colleagues. Thank you for the work that you do. Your job is to monitor the actions of the government and to report their actions to Parliament. It's very important. Allow me to return to your presentation. You say that the government and Parliament must adopt these budgetary measures in a timely fashion. When I read this, well, I understand that this means that the recovery measures haven't actually had an effect. So do you not believe that when we have to adopt these measures in a timely measure or in a timely fashion, we should have adopted these measures in November 2008 rather than now? Do you understand my question? Yes. Now, had the budgetary measures been discussed and adopted in November 2008 rather than January 2009, well, those measures would have had a real effect on the economy, and we'd be able to calculate the recovery effect now. Yes, sir, I understand your question fully. Absolutely. We need to boost our economy now. Had it been possible to implement budgetary measures before and earlier, well, perhaps that would have entailed a positive impact on the economy. You think that it would have been more effective then? Yes. So it clarifies what I was reading. You don't really believe that there should necessarily be other stimulus measures introduced now, because you say that Canada is an open economy. We're a small open economy, and that we depend on global and economic fiscal developments. Can you think of any economic measures that would have an immediate effect, a much more immediate effect than the measures that are currently being proposed, such as the EI measures? For instance, could we provide payments to the unemployed so that they can help kickstart the economy? Can we do something for seniors? So those who are the most vulnerable can at least meet the low-income cutoff. Are there any measures that would allow us to achieve the goals that have been set out by the government? This, of course, is being asked in the context that no other stimulus measures have been proposed. Perhaps I should clarify my mandate. I'm very comfortable talking about the economic context. I'm very comfortable talking about the fiscal outlook. If you look at page 13 of our presentation, there's a graph about our output gap. You can say that it's quite sharp. The government needs to minimize this gap, and perhaps, theoretically, it could increase its stimulus, and in our next report, we can look at the level of stimulus in the context of gross figures and net figures. But what I can say now very comfortably, that the output gap is much wider than in the past, much wider than in Budget 2009. But on the very specific question of adding economic stimulus so that we can start feeling the effect immediately, do you think that is a suggestion that you could make to us as you help us parliamentarians? It is absolutely necessary to implement the budget measures as soon as possible. We need to stimulate the economy, but I am not comfortable proposing other measures.
For your work. As you know, late last week, the United States government announced an additional extraordinary $1 trillion of support for financial institutions. This is obviously done since the Canadian budget. And in your report earlier today, you mentioned that Canada's recovery depends crucially on global economic and fiscal developments. I wonder if you could comment on the recently announced U.S. federal government stimulus measures and how these might affect Canada, and can you also comment on how the measures announced in the U.S. have changed since the budget was announced on January 27th?
I think it's probably fair to say that the budgetary process in the United States is probably a lot more complicated than ours. And I think many people were probably watching American news last night, and they got to see the president kind of talk about the importance of implementing their budget. In some senses, in our sense, because of the work of all parliamentarians, we're actually further down the road than the U.S. is. In terms of their level of stimulus that's being offered in the United States relative to Canada, the International Monetary Fund's recently produced a report, and they compared the different levels of stimulus. And there's some problems in terms of, are you comparing apples to apples or apples to oranges? But it's clear that the U.S. stimulus is larger than Canada's, but it's also probably also clear that the output gap or the economic problem in the United States is a little bit more severe as well. In terms of the efforts that we've seen recently and what potential impact it's having, I think it's fair to say that what we've seen in terms of monitoring private sector forecasts is, notwithstanding the fact that we're seeing more stimulus going into the economy, and particularly in terms of the financial sense, the outlook is getting worse, that it hasn't had the traction they were hoping to have. And I think that you've probably seen that in a lot of commentary from former governors of the Bank of Canada. And, I mean, they're still waiting for the stimulus to kind of really take hold. And I think it's being reflected in the weaker numbers that we're seeing in 2009.
Right. You would agree, though, and I think you pointed out in your report that even your own report has changed dramatically since your own projections have changed dramatically since the previous report. Private sector forecasters are changing almost daily. So how would the government, how would you suggest the government would respond, given that the economy or the economic projections are constantly changing? Obviously, things are being done in the United States, other countries in the world. That's all going to have some impact in Canada. There was a forecast done on the best information available in January. Those measures have just been passed in Parliament. The funds are about to be spent. Wouldn't it be prudent to see that those funds being spent, make sure they are spent, and then measure again to decide what further measures might be necessary?
Yes. Well, I think probably we should probably say that what we do, we don't, we like the Department of Finance, we survey private sector forecasts, and we do our own survey. We make this information available to you so that you can see the broader planning context. We're not actually in the forecasting game itself. We do this so that you can think about in terms of budgetary measures, the stimulus, like Mr. Carrier had suggested recently. But we don't do our own forecast. We provided a different and more detailed outlook for the first half of this year because we think what we're seeing now is absolutely historic in terms of the quarter-to-quarter declines, and that is, as you say, sir, very much a global problem. In terms of implementing the budget, I think it is fair to say that I think most commentators would say that we need to move as quickly as possible to put that stimulus in place, and it'll take a significant effort. But I'm sure that the government and the public service are working very hard to get the money out the door so it's flowing for the various projects that'll touch all aspects, all sectors of the economy in all regions as well. So the premium should really be on making sure that that stimulus is implemented.
Right.
But the situation is worse right now.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. You mentioned former Bank Governor Dodge, and I just note that he was quoted from a speech he made yesterday in Kingston in the Kingston Whig Standard this morning as saying that he wanted to make it clear that the Stephen Harper-led government is not to blame for the state of the economy. Dodge said that Canada will continue to face financial difficulty not because the government is failing or the banks, but because problems in the world are so large that this will take time to resolve. I wonder if you heard that, and also if you could comment on the projections that were made in terms of unemployment. Okay,
thank you.
Yes, sir. I think absolutely. If you look at the International Monetary Fund, its projections, this is definitely a global recession. They call it the Great Recession. It's unprecedented. We're seeing the world economy actually decline in real terms on a year-over-year basis. So it's just, I think as Paul Krugman says, this is a situation where sometimes bad things happen to a good economy, and Canada is a good economy. So it's definitely a worldwide phenomenon. I mean, also, sir, if you look at the tracking, or slide 5, where we look at Canada-U.S. monthly real GDP, and you look at what's happened since January 2008, you'll see that the numbers, even on a real GDP basis on a monthly, they actually track fairly closely, again highlighting how the situation in the United States impacts very importantly on Canada.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. We'll go to Ms. Hall-Finlay, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much, everybody, for being here. One aspect of the budget involves projected asset sales. It actually involves projected number for a combination of savings from departmental spending review as well as asset sales. And in another committee yesterday, we were given splits of the amount. So it's a little over $10 billion over 5 years. And by far the majority of that $10 billion is expected to come from the sale of assets. Not clear at all what kind of assets, and in fact it was confirmed yesterday, members of the department actually using the words like hypothetical. No list of assets. We were told that we would not be likely to get a list of assets until at least the summertime. We raised concerns about making a commitment to revenue on the sale of assets that have not yet been identified, the challenge of determining how you could arrive at that number, and then in particular a commitment then to sell assets at an economic time that we're facing now when the value of those assets may be significantly reduced. So we clearly have some concerns. I'm just wondering if you can comment a little bit on the validity of a budget including those kinds of numbers and any concerns that you might have.
We've examined and we've written a report on on issues coming out of the, I guess it was the fall November economic statement from Minister Flaherty, and so we've actually, in our words that we've actually printed are available on our website, as well as in direct discussions we've had with departmental officials, we said that it's not a good practice to adjust the fiscal framework for those sort of hypothetical style situations. That at a minimum, we also asked for a list as well as to what those assets would be under consideration. But I think the better practice would be, if they were planning to look at asset sales, to actually put together a list, put together the process they would have for disposition of that list. We would be happy to do due diligence on that list. And then, as it looks like there are potential, net fiscal revenues to come to the Consolidated Revenue Fund, that, again, we would do appropriate due diligence on that. But we share those concerns, lack of transparency and adjustment of fiscal framework without specifics.
Let me ask a specific one about the projection for this coming fiscal year. $2.3 billion, about 3 of that being from departmental review, so about $2 billion in 09-10 specifically from asset sales. We won't see a list of those, even a draft list, until the summertime. And even if there's an appreciation of value of those assets on the books of, say, 10%, and I would question that given the economic times that we're facing, a commitment, and we keep hearing the term fire sale of assets. So we're looking at selling assets to achieve $2 billion with an appreciation, which is questionable even at that, of say 10%. That would require the sale now of $20 billion worth of assets in 09-10 in order to achieve that $2 billion. Is that even remotely realistic?
When we look at the asset divestiture issue, why additional information is useful is because there is a time lag, when you're looking to actually present these for sale and examining the market opportunities for these assets. And as Mr. Page, this is part of the challenge of trying to book these revenues in the fiscal framework before clear identification. And we have requested the government provide some of these details, and not everything can be provided because there are confidential elements to these transactions. However, we are able to look at these things in confidence and provide parliamentarians some sense of the yield that might be from a Consolidated Revenue Fund position. But your point is correct in that there are time lags to implement, particularly when you're looking at having them apply in a particular fiscal year, and having more information about the nature of the asset and the potential transaction process could be useful to identify when that might hit the fiscal framework from a benefit point of view.
30 seconds.
And I appreciate the concern about confidentiality, but we were told yesterday it was not a question of that was not raised. It was quite bluntly said, we don't know what those assets are. We have not undertaken a review of what they might possibly be. So just a more blunt way of asking, is it realistic for the government to have booked $2 billion worth of revenue on asset sales in 09 or 10, given your knowledge of the current government's finances and the budget?
Okay. Mr. Page?
We need a list, but I would think based on what we know now and just the nature of the disposition, it doesn't sound very realistic. There's a high risk that it would be hard to materialize.
Thank you. We'll go to Mr. Kraft, please.
Thank you, and good afternoon, gentlemen. I'm looking at your prepared text, to Mr. Page, where you talked about the effectiveness of this government's operating economic package, and let me quote here on page 4, where you say, "But let me be clear. The statement on its own does not necessarily imply that more stimulus is required. As a small open economy, Canada's recovery depends not only on the actions policymakers are taking to provide accommodative fiscal and monetary policies, but also depends crucially on global economic and physical developments." And then you go on where you say, "Indeed, no reasonable assessment can be made until these measures have been implemented and more time has passed." And then I would like to refer then, just for a comparative thought that you might offer here, a comment from a recent IMF report, in which it states, "The IMF supports a large, timely, and well-targeted fiscal stimulus in Budget 09. The stimulus package is appropriately sized, well above the fund's benchmark of 2% of GDP. It is also prudently based on a worse economic outturn than private sector forecasts. With sizable infrastructure spending and permanent tax cuts, it's weighted towards items that are most effective in stimulating demand. Its steps to boost the safety net will protect Canada's most vulnerable, and training enhancements will facilitate relocation of misplaced workers. The mission also welcomes the move to cut external tariffs, which are in line with Canada's long-standing commitment to trade liberalization and openness." It finishes off when it says the IMF supports a strong fiscal package announced in January, which was large, timely, and well-targeted, and will buoy demand during the downturn. The focus now is appropriately on implementing that package. So with your comments and then the comments from the IMF now, my question to you is that, well, as you've stated as well, it really is just a little too early to comment on the effectiveness of the government's stimulus action from 2009. Isn't it reasonable to take some either solace or some comfort in the statements from the IMF that they have placed on Canada's economic situation right now? In other words, don't you feel that there is at least a little cause for either optimism or a level of confidence or a level of hope?
Sure, absolutely. I think our comments and the comments of the IMF are similar with respect to the stimulus nature, the package that was put forward. I think again, the IMF report was a very glowing report on Canada's situation relative to other countries. What we've also seen in the IMF report as well, though, is, again, in a global context, the global economy is much weaker, the U.S. economy is much weaker. Canada will be impacted by that. And as we've noted in the report, it was wise that the government added additional prudence, for 2009 and 10 in the budget projections. We needed that. Effectively, what we've seen today, and it's consistent with the IMF's new global update, which is a contraction, a recession in 2009 globally, that we've used up that prudence. In fact, we've gone beyond the prudence, and the numbers, at least right now, I think it's fair to say, even the IMF would say, because of the global situation, there's even greater downside economic risk. But the policy report from the IMF was very glowing.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, I'm a little bit concerned about but basically a number of these cliches, confidence is the essence of all success, attitude is everything, etc. I'm a little bit concerned about having a self-fulfilling prophecy with the possibility of doom and gloom, and yet I have an interesting quote here from a few years back, and what it says is, this happened to be back in 1985 actually. and where it says, nervous consumers don't make for a strong economic recovery. The solution, we believe, is for the federal government to avoid any panic rhetoric. It goes on and on. Alarmist statements about the federal deficit may be useful if the purpose is to frighten the public, and it's going on, of course. Now, it's not that I want to age someone, but of course the individual have to make that statement. Of course, was the current Liberal Finance Minister, Mr. McCallum, and so
question.
Well, do we as parliamentarians, do we agree with this notion, and do you believe that we should use some caution with alarmist statements at this time?
Mr. Page, please.
Well, so I think it's certainly our mandate to present this sort of economic and fiscal information before you based on averages of private sector forecasts, what it means fiscally. That's basically, for the most part, what we're doing. And we do talk about risks. I think from a policy perspective, I think in terms of bolstering consumer confidence, that and what we're hearing as well, I think from the International Monetary Fund, that we're going to need to deal with this global financial system before confidence will truly come back in a sustained way. And if we can do that, I think confidence will be there, sir.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Mr. McCallum again.
Thank you. First on the economics a little bit, it's somewhat ironic that the government side, when we were discussing this, was wanting to combine your appearance with that of Don Drummond and others to sort of counterbalance the effect. But I'm not sure they knew what they were asking for, because as I recall, Don Drummond is significantly more pessimistic than you are.
Yes, he
is. Now, we will be hearing from him tomorrow. But my question is, your deficit, if you combine the 2 years, the budget was approximately $64 billion. Yourselves are approximately $73 billion. And as I recall, Don Drummond is $80 billion or more. And yet you have a very negative growth outlook, at least for the current quarter, and also nominal GDP. And I seem to recall that for Don Drummond, approximately $1 billion of this year's deficit was because of additional EI payments and $2 billion next year. I think you've been asked this in certain ways, but I didn't catch the answer. So a double question. One, is one of the reasons for the difference between you and Don Drummond the fact that he has included additional EI benefits and you have not? And more generally, why, given your rather pessimistic growth outlook, is Don Drummond a lot more pessimistic on the deficit than you are?
Do you want me? Okay, go ahead.
Just for clarification, Mr. McCallum, the quarterly number that we show on slide 8, that is our own estimate, PBO's estimate,
yes,
are not the basis for the fiscal projections that we provided. The fiscal projection that we provided in this document is based on private sector average forecast.
So if you use your own growth projections, your fiscal deficit would be
probably
bigger.
Would have been worse,
yeah.
but we haven't done a full fiscal projection for the full year. So this is just for us, just the first half of the year. It is based on monitoring of indicators that are available. So if we were to apply this throughout the year, obviously the numbers would be worse than what the private sector average shows.
But you presumably have read the TD analysis.
Yes.
Can you give us an idea in general terms why your deficit is 73 and theirs is 82, I believe?
Again, we apply only fiscal sensitivities that we were provided by the Department of Finance, but as TD has done, I assume, full projections. Yeah. Based on their assumption about EI, other assumption in terms of share of corporate profits relative to personal income, the other factors that may affect the fiscal projection. We have not done that in this document.
Okay, and yes, Mr. Page.
Chris, do you have Don's number? He's more pessimistic.
I think in terms of nominal GDP growth, I think Mr. Drummond's projection for 2009 is in line with what we have. I think it's a decline of 4.4%. But in his projection, he's also taking views or changing views on the underlying, let's say, the income composition. So the corporate profits might be quite a bit weaker than he had. Whereas when we're using fiscal sensitivities, the underlying assumption is that the reductions are spread proportionately across. Right. So the two, it's not, I would say, a fair comparison to compare projection versus a shock minus control estimate.
So in some sense, maybe you'd agree that given we're at the stage of the cycle where corporate profits, which are highly sensitive, are dropping like a stone, that his more detailed analysis might make his larger deficit projections more closer to the mark. Is that a fair statement?
I would think so. We've, in our presentation, tried to flag the downside risk to our projections. And I would imagine that given our, if we did do a fully independent projection based off of our monitoring for the first half of the year, that we would have significantly lower nominal GDP growth than even Mr. Drummond.
Well, thank you. He'll be here tomorrow anyway to give aid and comfort to the government, so we'll ask him that question. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. McCallum. We'll go to Mr. Wallace, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I have a number of questions, so I'll ask you to be succinct in your answers. Your discussion today talks about the first quarter. That's the calendar quarter. Is that not correct?
That's correct.
That's right.
First quarter.
But the government's year starts April 1st. It's not the calendar quarter. So why, if you're the budgetary office for the Government of Canada, are you not comparing our budgetary quarter with the government's actual quarter to the quarter that exists in real time? Like why? So, you know, I've heard comments about stimulus not getting out there faster. Well, the estimates are still the spending is still in the Senate. They haven't even got passed yet. So why wouldn't we, as if your job's to look at what's in the budget and whether it's accurate or not? I don't think it's to comment on whether it's good policy or not.
Correct.
Right? Like,
correct.
If we had nothing in the stimulus pack, if we didn't have a stimulus package, you couldn't come here technically and say, well, we should have had a stimulus package. You could come here and say what you put in the budget is accurate or not, but not that we need a stimulus package. Is that not an accurate statement?
Correct. We're not here to provide suggestions on new policy measures that could, you know, make the stimulus package bigger, smaller, or different.
Right.
But what we do want to do is make sure you have a really good sense of what's happening in the first quarter in the Canadian economy, based on our monitoring.
The calendar quarter, but not the quarter that...
The first 3 months of 2009, right. Because we have additional information that, you know, finance officials and Minister Flay would not have had in terms of when it put together its January projections.
Mr. Page, to be more, I don't mean to be rude. It's just trying to get some stuff in. To be accurate, though, that once our first quarter of government is done, and then you analyze what we've done in that first quarter in terms of money out the door, let's use it that way, compared to what the budget actually said, that would be a more accurate analysis. That will be an accurate analysis. Is that not correct?
Absolutely. We focused today, on our briefing today, just on economic implications.
Okay.
It's an economic, not a fiscal analysis, per se, on the first quarter.
Right. I find it strange that the Liberal Party wouldn't support my motion for peer review of what you have to say, but now they are. So I'm not asking you to comment.
Actually, I'm very supportive of peer review, sir.
Yeah,
most of our products are peer reviewed. In fact, I'm leaving tonight to go to speak to business economists in Victoria and Winnipeg.
Okay. I appreciate also that you're meeting with the Deputy Minister and you're getting some feedback. And if there is some issues in terms of information, I hope they get resolved relatively quickly. The issue of, you know, you show us the GDP against the U.S. How come you didn't show us any of the positive stuff that Canada is doing in comparison to? Like, we're in better shape. Would you not agree than we are than our American friends on a number of issues, whether it's mortgages, failure rates, all those kinds of things? Is there a reason that you only show us the sort of the negative and not where Canada is better than others?
Actually, we're pretty much focused on those headline numbers that the government of the day would be focused on as well, in terms of what it means for the overall for the Canadian economy, what its implications are for the fiscal situation. If you asked us to kind of to comb the numbers and looking for the most positive kind of indicators, there are some positive indicators, sir. We saw a jump in retail sales in January, but mind you, was after a very steep decline in December. Motor vehicle sales as well strengthened in January relative to where they were in December. We can look for those things, and the markets certainly have strengthened, sir, in the last number of weeks.
Do I have a minute? Okay. My last question is a budgetary question to the budgetary office. The revenues that we project in there are projections. Is that not correct? Whether they're corporate, personal, those revenues that are based in the budget are projections. Is that correct?
Correct.
So the sale of, would you agree that the Government of Canada owns more than $10 billion worth of assets?
Absolutely,
Right.
sir.
So it's a projection of what we could, as part of the budget, part of the revenue stream. Part of that is a reduction in wasteful government spending. Part of it is in reduction of assets. But they are all projections. Would you agree with that then?
That assets, that the projection that
Those are all
revenues will be forthcoming
Right.
from asset sales?
Yeah, that's just a projection of what they've put out there. Now, you did make the point that they didn't show you, and they haven't shown me, what those assets would be.
Correct, sir.
But then you made the statement, and I don't mean to be rude, you made the statement that you didn't think it was prudent or achievable or something along those lines. Shouldn't the answer been, well, based on the information I have or don't have, I really can't comment on that because it is just projections, as is the corporate revenues,
Okay.
as is the
Final
income tax
question.
revenue, or the personal tax revenues, and all the other revenue streams that are indicated in the budget.
Well, sir, on that point, I think when the government introduced measures, as it did in its 2009 budget, it introduced tax reduction measures. Those were instituted. There was a Ways and Means motion, so they were implemented. Canadians will benefit by those sorts of sales. We know exactly what they're doing. What we don't see, we've seen a global number in asset sales, but we haven't seen the list, sir. That's really what we're calling. We made that point back last year, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Wallace. I'm sorry, your time is up. We'll go to Mr. Mulcair.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wish to ask Mr. Page, in reference to the past conversation, how many permanent employees are there within your office?
At the PBO right now, the Parliamentary Budget Office, we have 8 permanent employees. We have a number of employees that are on secondment, including Chris Matei here is kind of heads up. His secondment is over this year, so it's very important that we were able to put him on a permanent basis so that we could assure that next year when we're in front of you at this time.
We want him on a permanent basis too, so that's why I'm asking the question. So how many other requests have you made to, sorry, I don't know the jargon of the civil services in English well enough, pour titulariser, pour rendre permanent vos employés? Combien de demandes vous avez?
Well, if again,
How many were you able to hire permanently?
2.75 million per year. Those monies are there in the fiscal framework. We were planning on a staff of about 17 or 18 people to provide service to you. We have 8 permanent employees now. We have 5 on secondments, and so we would like to put at least those 5 on secondments on a permanent basis. But again, it's very important. I was planning on a budget of $2.8 million a year, so it's very important that we confirm that budget as soon as possible, so we don't have to let these people go.
Ben, je peux vous assurer que
But I can give you the assurance that on this side of the table, there is consensus to support your work. I want to get back to an issue raised by Mr. Cramp. It's true that the IMF issues a report card, if you will, of all countries. It allows us to know if, in fact, certain countries have achieved certain levels. It's almost as though we have asked everyone to bring something to dinner for a family reunion, and Canada seems to be like the brother-in-law who seems to be flying on the coattails of everyone else. Because we were talking about the sale of assets earlier, and that's just pure fiction. And as for expenditures cuts, they boast being good public administrators, but yet, well before the crisis, the Conservatives have actually increased government expenditures. In fact, you provided us several examples. There was the war in Afghanistan, many other programs. We have no results, and now we need money to spend, and the government is saying that it's going to get the money through the sale of assets. In your opinion, in light of everything that we have heard, is Canada going to meet the 2% target? And in preparation of the London summit next week, should we actually be suggesting 4%? To your mind, ways of raising revenue, such as the sale of proceeds, are actually measures that can stimulate the economy, or do we need more direct measures, such as increasing employment insurance?
Fund report. First of all, it was a very glowing report on Canada. I think they think our situation is, and we did meet with them individually when they were here doing their review. They met the Parliamentary Budget Office. They think we're on the right policy track, and I think for the most part they think that you know, that the Canadian economy is better positioned going into this recession than many other economies. Like, having said that, in terms of the level of stimulus, they took the government's numbers and they compared them pretty much holus bolus with other countries. So they looked at the full stimulus, the $40 billion stimulus. They did not make changes, which we in our previous analysis we talked about in terms of gross and net. Issues around potentially contractionary style impacts around strategic reviews, asset sales, leverage-related issues, and the freezing of the premium rate. So they didn't do that gross or net. They didn't do that for other countries as well too. So
they're taking it at face value. Merci, Monsieur le Président. Une dernière petite question, vous venez de me dire, c'est ça? Ben, à ce moment-là, je voulais justement.
One last question. I'd like Mr. Page to tell me what are the preconditions, be they measures taken by the provinces or municipalities for the amount to be legitimate.
Thank you, Mr. Mulcair. We'll go to Mr. McKay, please.
I think we should sell off the eternal flame. We could securitize the cash flow, get AIG to insure it, and then do some derivatives on that. Help out the government's projections. Yeah, the gas will come from Alberta. Will help out there.
Gas prices are very low right now.
Yeah. It's a good deal. It's a good deal. I'm looking at page 21 of your presentation here, and what you show is effectively the effect of a stimulus in the budget is a 1.9% increase in GDP, and yet you show the last quarter of 08, first quarter of 09 as dramatically below the budgetary estimates, both with and without GDP. So the question is, do you hold to the 1.9% of a stimulus effect when your projections are going so much more dramatically below the budgetary projections?
Well, first, I think the purpose of this graph is actually using the government's numbers to show what it's assuming. And we plotted that the level of transparency that the government had, particularly in its annex in the budget, which highlighted the multipliers for all the different programs. So I believe you raised questions about the multipliers last time we were here. So first of all, we applaud that. What this graph basically shows on page 21 is that what we know now about the first quarter of 2009, it's so dramatically worse that we've lost 200,000 jobs in January, February alone. And a lot of private sector forecasters are saying that March is probably going to be another kind of unfortunate month as well too, another significant job loss. So that 1.9% real GDP impact actually translated into employment numbers, which I believe is on the next slide, of about 190,000 over that period of time. We've lost those jobs already in January and February. So we're just highlighting that in this graph. The starting point to equal zero is much worse than based on the information that Minister Flaherty and the government had in January budget.
The question becomes then, though, is it really go big or go home? If you're putting the same amount of stimulus in that the government projected in its budget, and now you're applying it to the projection that you now have based on those two quarters, are you essentially, arguably, you're just wasting your money at this level? Is that a fair observation?
Well, we're not saying that the stimulus has really had, I think this is Mr. Wallace's question, the money has not flowed out the door at this point in time, so we haven't had that impact. But I think what we are seeing is that that gap that exists between where the economy should be going, where do we expect it to go at trend value, and where it's projected to go is getting much wider. The policy challenge faced by all Canadians, by parliamentarians, is much more significant because of what we've seen already in the first quarter of 2009 and what private sector forecasts are saying, including, which is consistent with the International Monetary Fund going forward. The policy challenge is much bigger.
Wayne Gretzky was a brilliant hockey player because he knew where the puck was going, not where the puck was. And if you follow your chart, a reasonable projection of your chart, it would lead one to the conclusion that the government's stimulus package, no matter how dressed up it is, how is stated in the government's terms without any skepticism whatsoever, is clearly inadequate to do the job of ameliorating the effects of this economic drop. Is that a fair, reasonable observation?
Well, I think, again, what we're saying is that the challenge that we face now, because of the weakness of the economy, is much bigger.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McKay. We'll go Monsieur Laforêt.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Page, everyone has come to a sort of agreement. I have the opportunity again to congratulate you for your work, and the government seems to be saying that they're the ones responsible for creating your position. However, since you're doing such a great job, I'd like for you to tell us that if you do not receive the budget increase, that is, if you don't receive the $2.7 million that you were promised, will you be able to provide us documentation and analysis? Will your opinion be as good quality? Or because of the budget cutbacks, will your job be compromised because you don't have a sufficient number of staff members in your office? We all know that we are experiencing a full-blown recession, and every single day we talk about the economy. There's going to be an increased number of requests from parliamentarians who will have questions for you about the economy. Now, if you don't receive the funding, will you be able to fulfill your role? Thank you, Mr. Laforêt, for your question. I think I can tell you that the quality of our work relies and depends on people who work for us. Chris, Mustafa, Sahir, and everyone who is here. They have significant experience to provide you good quality analysis. During a time of economic crisis, it is absolutely crucial to have accurate analysis.
Sure, we'll have to we can't do our mandate. When I was given the contract, I was told our budget would be $2.7, $2.8 million. So I hired on the basis of that. It was probably too little of a budget based on the width of our mandate, which includes, analysis on the economy, analysis on the nation's finances, costing like wars in Afghanistan, or we're going to release a report within a month on Aboriginal educational infrastructure, costing projects, scrutiny of the estimates. We'll have to decide what elements of our mandate we do not do. So we will not provide services. And so if I'm here a year from today and I don't have the benefit of somebody like Chris or Mustafa, we won't be providing analysis on the economy, on the economic projections. You need people that are familiar with econometric models, can work with people like Don Drummond, Mr. McCallum, and Mr. Drummond on a regular basis, look at their projections, compare numbers, present des bonnes analyses pour vous. C'est une question critiquable pour moi.
That is a critical issue for me. Because ultimately, your work was organized in such a way to work within the $2.7 million budget. In response to a question asked by Mr. Menzies, you said that two of your colleagues are from the Department of Finance. With respect to documents that you need to draft your first report, well, I'm not sure if I properly understood, but did you receive all of the documents that you were expecting to receive in order to carry out your work to analyze the first progress report of the government budget?
That we've asked for that dealt with economic projections. So even in slides that I think I think might have been Mr. Wallace that talked about, perhaps Mr. McKay, when we actually have to do some very difficult arithmetic in order to create those slides, because we're not given quarterly profiles. We have to work with what we have in the budgets to actually back some of this information out. And as Chris said earlier, when you're looking at calculations, economic impacts on deficits, you need to have compositions of GNP, profits, wages, etc. We've asked for that information. That information in the past was made available, actually published in past documents. It was made available to private sector firms. We need that information.
Mr.
Menzies said that there was a single document that was from Cabinet, and you're saying that there's more?
Nada.
All right, go to Mr. Menzies now.
Merci.
Thank you, and very appropriate timing. Please remember, Mr. Page, that I went to bat for you after the last session, and to clarify, that you were getting the information that you had requested. And I have confirmation that up to that point, you had received everything that you had requested. And up to this point, there's one document, and I realize that you folks are esteemed economists. You say that you don't think it's cabinet confidentiality, and I didn't say it was a cabinet document, that this would breach cabinet confidentiality, but we have legal opinions that say it would. So that's why you haven't received that. And a comment to Mr. Mathieu, who had said that you had asked for corporate profits, wages, and salaries.
When a member quotes a document, we can ask him to table it, to bring it before the committee. Mr. Menzies has just mentioned that he possesses a legal opinion. I think that for the benefit of this committee, the least that he could do would table that legal opinion. It would be good for us to be able to look at it.
I have verbal confirmation right now, and please forgive me, I don't have the document in front of me. I'm just trying to clear the record,
another meeting.
Thomas.
Another
just trying to clear the record. I'm not making a partisan comment here. I'm just trying to make sure that this is accurate. Thank you.
Okay.
So, Mr. Chairman, I want your ruling on my point of order. I'm allowed as a member to ask anyone who cites a document to table it. He says he has a legal opinion. Now he says he doesn't. But if he does have a legal opinion, verbally, maybe he could have it confirmed in writing, and he can table it before this committee so we can all know that whether or not that opinion says what he says it says, even though it doesn't exist.
Mr. Menzies, do you want to respond?
I would be glad to do my best to provide that to you, Thomas.
Okay.
If I can continue.
Thank you, Mr. Menzies.
Mr. Mathieu had suggested that your office had asked for corporate profits, wages, and salaries. My understanding is that was never requested. My understanding is also that you put all of your requests on your website, and that is not on your website. So we have at least a difference of opinion here. The one question, and going back to my first question, to Mr. Page, I was trying to flesh out what is the actual difference in fundamentals between the Canadian economy and the weakness of the U.S. economy. If you could, can you, I mean, as I said, the GDP numbers are drastically, debt to GDP numbers are ratio is drastically different. What is the fundamental difference? Is the stimulus package in the U.S., has it been as effective as hoped, as what we're projecting here?
Well, actually, Mr. Menzies, I'll start with the economic question first, then we'll go to the data issue, and I'll be brief. it may be that we could provide, maybe it'd be helpful for us to unpack this a little bit for the committee members to do a more substantive Canada-U.S. comparison of fundamentals. We'd be happy to do that. And we would look at some of the imbalances that existed in the United States, what has happened to those imbalances recently, what imbalances we may have had in the Canadian economy. By that I mean consumer balance sheets, corporate balance sheets, external budget balances, external balances, trade balances, fiscal balances, and we could show basically the nature of some of those fundamentals, look at savings rates. We'd be happy to do that if you'd like to do that. It would be complementary, to the report that we released earlier that you referred to that looked at the GDP numbers. But I could say, sir, like again, even if you look backwards and you look at slide 5 as an example, and you look at Canada-U.S. monthly real GDP, and you look at the performances in 2008, you can get a sense, looking at that very high-level headline number, that that there are not substantial differences in terms of real gross domestic product, when you look backwards. And when you look forward, I think, there are some differences in the forecasts. And, but again, in our study, if you want us to undertake that kind of work, we'd be happy to do that. And Mr. Wallace is nodding as well, so.
One other quick question, if we can. On slide 22, or slide 20, or page 20, Mr. Decker just brought this to my attention. Can you explain on the second graph the difference between these are employment budget, the impact on employment of budget. You have 2010, and the last column is 210 Q4. Now, are you talking 160,000 jobs total 210, and then 189 for the fourth quarter? Just a clarification, if you could, on that.
Yeah, slide 20.
Slide 20.
Actually, on this slide, sir, these actually numbers come right from the federal budget. So in the the 2019 year annual average numbers. So and the Q4s are just reflect what happens in the fourth quarter. And sir, if I may, Chair, if I could just ask Chris to briefly deal with the information issue, because a question was raised earlier.
Okay, thank you. The data that we requested, we provided a list of all the series that we needed in an attached spreadsheet, both for the fall economic and fiscal statement as well as for budget 2009. And the projections that we requested, so the mnemonics for all these series are available. We have a good knowledge of the macroeconometric model that the department uses to do forecasting, and indeed we've used it ourselves in our past jobs there. So that information is provided and very detailed. I think there are over 100 series that are being requested. But we are requesting the status quo basis projections. So this would be independent or excluding any measures that might be considered at that time. And I would just, on the cabinet confidence issue, these are projections that are shared with the Bank of Canada, they're shared with the OECD, and as Mr. Page has suggested, they have been provided to private sector forecasters in the past and published in Department of Finance documents.
Thank you. Thank you. We'll go to Mr. McCallum, please.
Well, thank you. Maybe I could pursue this question of information a little bit. I find it hard, as was just referred to, that a document could be considered a cabinet secret and not be provided to you when that same information is provided to private sector forecasters. That's a little bit difficult to understand. I also find it difficult to understand how the government side is boasting about their website and how powerful it is, and my staff checked their website just a few minutes ago, and they're still asking the Senate to pass the budget. And that was 2 weeks ago. So is this the government's idea of an up-to-date website that will keep Canadians informed? So I guess my questioning, Mr. Page, to you is, first of all, I heard you say no information from finance on projections has been forthcoming.
Correct.
Correct. Let me just ask you a few other questions. You had a meeting with the Minister of Finance and the President of the Treasury Board, and I think you said they would take the issues under advisement. Is that right?
We raised issues, sir, with respect to providing a list of identified items related to Vote 35, the need for that, and also a willingness, because, Minister Flaherty has publicly talked about his concerns related to due diligence, the risk related to implement measures, that if we could play a role for all parliamentarians in terms of scoring some of that risk assessment.
Okay. Did you speak to the Treasury Board officials at all about whether they would cooperate with you in terms of providing information on getting money out the door?
No, but we've spoken with the President of the Treasury Board.
Okay, so really you haven't gotten anywhere yet on this matter. Okay, my last question.
Actually, if I could I did speak to the Wayne Waters, the Secretary of the Treasury Board, early on when just to request a meeting to talk about quarterly reporting early on, and that meeting hasn't happened yet.
And when did you ask for the meeting?
Well, it's actually, I wanted to give him a heads up that we were preparing what we thought was a best practice quarterly reporting technique, and I wanted to sit down in advance of release of the document.
So how long ago approximately did you ask to meet him?
It was before we actually released our document. Was it March 11th? I'm just checking the date. March 11th, we released our quarterly reporting
About
document.
2 weeks ago. Okay. And I guess my last question is, I'm a little bit concerned about basing our assessment on a government website. Now, even if they did update it daily rather than it still having 2-week out-of-date information, it would be they who would choose which numbers to present and how. And so I think from an economist's point of view, or scrutiny, it would seem to me that we need an independent voice to ask for which numbers are relevant for our purposes, rather than rely on the person being monitored or the person under probation to himself independently decide which numbers to give the world to. Is that a reasonable point of view?
Well, what we highlighted today was like looking forward to the second quarterly report, when what we didn't see in the first report are those indicators and how they would show, as you said earlier, sir, how the money would flow, what indicators they would be using to show that what impact these programs are having in terms of stimulus on the economy. We didn't see that in the first report. They may have been asking too much. We actually were quite impressed with the first report in terms of level of detail, but we did not see those forward-looking indicators that will actually measure when the money does start to flow, is it having an impact? It may be useful to have an independent assessment on those types of indicators and making, and perhaps even on the money and how the money is flowing. I think the Auditor General has already indicated that she will be providing an audit, but again, that will be in a very retrospective kind of look.
Well, personally, I'm less concerned about analyzing the impact of the money when we know how much money it is, because lots of people in the private sector can do that. Any economist, a good economist, can do that. But what other people from the outside, no matter how good they are as economists, cannot do is get their hands on data that the government doesn't want to give them. And so I think, and this is why I'm concerned you don't seem to be making any progress with the government, that they seem to be saying, you'll take the numbers we choose to give you in our website, and we won't give you the raw data with which to do the analysis. Is that a fair statement?
We would be able to do a much better analysis if we had raw data.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. McCallum. We'll go to, is it Mr. Cramp or Mr. Wallace first?
Just have one quick question, and I'll flip it over to my colleague. On page 13 on your graphs, your output gap, where you say the projected downturn is expected to be worse than past recessions. I accept your information here, but I'd like to turn that around to the average everyday citizen and how this recessionary situation affects them. And what I'm referring to, I can recall being in business back in the 80s and being subject to the 22% interest rate and being subject to a very, very high inflation and having that affect the population in a very, very, very serious manner. Now, we don't have those same factors now while we have different problems. So can you relate the comparative effect on the everyday citizen then versus now based on this graph?
You need much more information, sir, to provide an individual citizen perspective as to the level of pain that we're experiencing now, or starting to experience, as, in the first quarter of 2000, with previous recessions in the 90s and 80s. In the information we presented today, we're talking about level of output. We're getting a level of output perspective in terms of the Canadian economy. We've also talked about employment, and we've provided comparisons with previous recessions. But the job losses to date are already quite significant.
Okay. We've got a minute left?
You have a minute, Mr. Walsh.
Okay, very quickly. First of all, I find it kind of ironic, the Liberals in 2006 didn't support the budget. Actually, the Bloc members did. The Bloc did, and this was in there. And then they supported our the current plan that we have in front of them, and they supported last night the votes on the spending, which are now over at the Senate. But my question is, on page 2, my staff will begin a more detailed assessment of potential high-risk initiatives based on comparables derived from jurisdictions and international best practices. What is your definition, and maybe you can give me an example, just because I don't know, potential high-risk initiatives? What are you talking about?
Go ahead. High-risk initiatives. Did you get the question?
Yeah, sorry. I'm sorry, could you...
Well, I'm just reading your writing.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Page 2, under Section 1, it says, depending on which information gaps remain after the second report, my staff may begin a more detailed assessment on potential high-risk initiatives. I don't know what you're talking about in terms of high-risk initiatives.
Oh, okay.
What's your definition of a high-risk initiative that's outlined in the economic update?
Well, so
economic plan.
The perspective that we would take, and again, there are almost 100 measures that were put through the Budget Implementation Act. Some of them, for example, like infrastructure, we've known in the past have had high lapses. We may, relative difficulty in order to get the money out the door, into shovel-ready kind of projects that would have an impact. That might be an example where, based on indicators of money flowing, that this is a high-risk initiative. It wouldn't have we wouldn't be getting the money out the door in a timely way.
The risk of it not happening is the high risk. The better potential for it not to happen.
Correct, sir.
Is your definition of high risk.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Walsh. We'll go to Mr. McKay, please.
Just was looking at Table 22 here and trying to relate it to things that ordinary folks would understand. So with if the budget did nothing, the employment impact would be somewhere below 17,100 jobs. Sorry, can you just read that chart for me, because I'm not quite sure I understand the implications of what you're putting into that chart, please. And that's on page 22.
Okay. What we've tried to do here is to provide the projections that were underlying the estimated economic impacts in Annex 1 of Budget 2009. This budget did provide the, let's say, the end point, the 189,000 jobs. And from the other assumptions on projected unemployment rates, we've tried to back out the estimated levels of employment. Now, the line that you see drawn here reflects, the lowest line reflects the actual job losses to date. So this, if we assume that there have been no impacts of the stimulus at this time, then this would be excluding any impacts.
That effectively means there's 16,900,000 jobs still left in the economy. Is that what that means?
Yes, that's the level of employment in thousands. Yes. So if let's say the world unfolded as was envisaged in the Budget 2009 outlook, we would have stayed on probably very close to that middle line, and also assuming none of the stimulus impacts took effect that early on. But the world did not unfold that way, and there were significantly more job losses than had been forecast. So the starting point of the sort of the economic challenge has shifted, and it's much more pessimistic than previously anticipated.
Yeah, it's quite dramatic when you chart it that way. So you go back to, in your statement here. You say, a small open economy, Canada's recovery depends not only on the actions of policymakers providing accommodative fiscal and monetary policies, but also depends crucially on global economic and fiscal developments. Well, the monetary capacity is pretty well zeroed out at this point. I mean, you can play around with some credit stuff, which is fine. The fiscal is already underwater, and so the real question becomes, if even the government wanted to get back to its original line, it would have to anticipate putting in a massive fiscal stimulus. Is that a reasonable conclusion?
Well, perhaps I could. I think you've had the opportunity to speak to Mr. Carney about the monetary policy and what the transmission mechanism looks like, and so as he lower interest rates or he provides quantitative easing to banks, the time lags that are involved. I think it's fair to say the bank is still hoping that impact will play out. I think it's I guess what Chris has said is that the starting point is much worse right now, and the policy challenge again is that much bigger. It'll be a choice down the road whether or not more stimulus is required and what the impact of that stimulus would be. But the starting point is much more significantly worse.
Yeah. So you run out of monetary stimulus. You're pretty well at zero. You've your credit. There may be still some gas in the tank there. You can still buy up some more paper. But really, if in fact the government is serious about addressing the employment problem, they have to come up immediately with an enormous fiscal stimulus package, or if they just stay with the so-called plan that they currently have, reality has already overtaken them. Is that fair?
I think in terms of the employment picture and the output numbers that we've seen in the fourth quarter and the employment pictures we've seen in the fourth quarter in the first few months, that the reality is much it's very serious, it's much more negative. And whether it's again in future budgets, whether additional stimulus is met, that's a down the road consideration. We haven't implemented the current budget yet.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Page, I want to thank you very much with you and your colleagues for coming out today and for your presentation, your information, answering our questions. Colleagues, will meet tomorrow at 9 a.m. Meeting adjourned. Thank you.